the dust of promise. Arizona was the color of regret. It settled on everything, on the warped boards of the Dawson porch, on the cracked lip of the water barrel, and on the wilted dreams of Clara Dawson. At 19, she had her mother's pale hair and her father's haunted eyes, a combination that made her look like a ghost drifting through the sun-bleached wreckage of her own life. Their small house sagged at the edge of town, a final, weary sigh before the desert took over completely. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale whiskey and decay, not of the body, but of the soul. Her father, John Dawson, sat at the table, his hand trembling as he stared into an empty glass. He had once been a man of substance, a merchant with a laugh that filled a room. But the death of his beloved Mary had hollowed him out, and the bottle had filled the void. One bad investment followed another. One game of cards bled into the next, until all they had left were debts and the suffocating silence her mother's absence had carved into the walls. Clara's only inheritance of value was not the failing house or the barren patch of land, but a small, heavy leather pouch hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her mother's sewing room. Inside lay a trove of gold coins, double eagles mostly, saved over years. "This is for your future, my Clara," Mary had whispered to her years ago, her hands warm on Clara's. "It is to ensure you marry a good man, a man who will cherish you. It is your shield." That shield was about to be shattered. Her father had found the pouch 2 nights ago. Clara had heard the floorboard creak, then the soft, damning clink of coin on coin. She had said nothing, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Now, he cleared his throat, a dry, rattling sound. "Clara," he began, not looking at her. "Sheriff Reddick is coming this afternoon." Clara paused her mending, the needle still in the fabric of her father's worn shirt. Bo Reddick. The name was a chill that snaked through the oppressive Arizona heat. He was the law and promise, but his brand of justice was hammered out with fists and fear. He was a man who owned half the county and ruled the other half with an iron gaze. He was twice her age, with a face like carved granite and eyes that saw everything as something to be bought or broken. "Why is he coming here, Father?" she asked, her voice small. John Dawson finally lifted his head. The shame in his eyes was a raw, open wound, but it was quickly papered over with a brittle defensiveness. "He has been generous. He has agreed to clear my accounts. All of them." The needle pricked Clara's finger. A single drop of blood welled, dark against her pale skin. "And what did you give him in return?" The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Your dowry," he finally mumbled, his gaze falling back to the empty glass. "And your hand." The room tilted. Clara felt the air rush from her lungs, replaced by an icy dread. Her dowry, her mother's love, her mother's hope, melted down and poured into the hands of a gambler. But that was not the worst of it. Her hand. He had not just sold her future, he had sold her. "You traded me," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "You traded me for your debts." "It is a marriage, Clara!" he snapped, slamming a fist on the table. The glass jumped. "He is the sheriff, a powerful man. He will provide for you, protect you. It is the best I could do, the only thing I could do." Protection. The word was a mockery. Everyone knew what kind of man Bo Reddick was. He did not protect, he possessed. He did not love, he owned. Clara looked at her father, at the hollowed-out shell of the man who was supposed to be her shield, and she saw the full depth of his betrayal. He had not saved her. He had sacrificed her to save himself. Sheriff Bo Reddick arrived not in a carriage, but on a massive black stallion that seemed to carve a shadow into the very sunlight. He dismounted with a fluid, predatory grace, his spurs jingling a death knell on the hard-packed earth. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder and thick in the chest, his face weathered by the sun and a life of unsmiling authority. He handed the reins to one of the two deputies who flanked him like loyal hounds. He did not greet her father. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found Clara where she stood frozen on the porch. They swept over her, a slow, appraising gaze that stripped her bare, weighed her, and found her satisfactory for his purposes. It was not the look of a suitor. It was the look of a man inspecting livestock. "The girl is ready?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Clara's bones. His question was directed at her father, but his eyes never left her. "She is," John Dawson said, his voice fawning. "She is a good girl, sheriff, obedient." Bo Reddick gave a slow, cold smile that did not reach his eyes. "We will see." He nodded once. "Get your things. You will ride with me." There was no talk of a ceremony, no mention of a preacher. Clara, numb with a despair too deep for tears, went inside and gathered her meager belongings, a few spare dresses, her mother's worn Bible, and the leather-bound journal filled with her mother's elegant script. These were her only treasures now, the last remnants of a life that was already gone. When she came back out, her father would not meet her eyes. He simply stood, a stooped and broken figure, as a deputy strapped her small bag to the back of the sheriff's horse. Bo Reddick put his hands on her waist and lifted her onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing. The touch of his hands was hard and impersonal, a claim of ownership. She sat stiffly in front of him, her back refusing to touch his chest. As the horse turned and began the slow ride out of promise, she did not look back. There was nothing left there to see. The sheriff's ranch was a fortress. It was a sprawling adobe structure, surrounded by a high wall that seemed designed to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something in. It was meticulously clean, unnervingly quiet. The floors were swept, the furniture polished to a high gleam, but there was no warmth, no life. The Mexican woman who served as housekeeper, a silent woman named Rosa, moved through the rooms like a phantom, her eyes always downcast. She showed Clara to a small, spare room with a sturdy bed, a washstand, and a single window that was barred with decorative ironwork. Clara had expected a cold and formal arrangement, a life of quiet indifference. She was not prepared for the psychological cage Bo began to build around her. He did not shout or strike her. His cruelty was a more patient, insidious thing. It was in the way he watched her, his eyes following her every move, even when he pretended to be reading a report. It was in the way he would suddenly appear in a doorway, silent and immense, making her gasp. "A good wife should be seen and not heard," he told her one evening at dinner, the first words he had spoken to her all day. He had been watching her stare out the window. "And she should have no reason to look outside. Everything you need is here." He controlled every aspect of her existence. He told her when to eat, what to wear from the new, plain dresses he had purchased for her, and forbade her from leaving the house without his explicit permission, which was never granted. He would ask her questions about her day, about what she had thought, what she had read in her mother's Bible, and his inquiries felt less like conversation and more like an interrogation. He was searching for any sign of defiance, any flicker of an independent thought. "Your father sold you to me, Clara," he said to her one afternoon, his voice soft but laced with steel. He stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "That means you are my property. A man has a right to do what he wants with his property. You would do well to remember that." Fear became her constant companion, a cold phantom that sat on her chest and stole her breath. She spent her days in a state of high alert, her nerves stretched thin. The vast, quiet house became a prison, and Bo Reddick was her warden. Her only escape was into the pages of her mother's Bible and journal. In the privacy of her locked room, the only place she felt a sliver of safety, she would trace her mother's words, whispering them aloud. The journal was filled with reflections on faith, on the harsh beauty of the desert, and on the deep, abiding love she had for her daughter. Be strong. My Clara. One entry read, "The world will try to grind you down, to make you small, but your spirit is a light that no man can extinguish. Do not let them." Clara clung to those words as a drowning woman clings to driftwood. They were a reminder that she was more than Bo Reddick's property. She was Mary Dawson's daughter. Days bled into a week, then 2. There was still no mention of a wedding. When Clara finally found the courage to ask, her voice a trembling thread of sound, Bo only smiled that cold, thin smile. "All in good time," he said, polishing the barrel of his revolver. "A man needs to be sure his horse is broken before he puts his brand on it. I am merely testing your obedience. A wife who does not obey is worthless." The ugly truth of his words settled over her, cold and heavy as a shroud. He had her dowry, or what her father had claimed was her dowry. He had her. There was no need for a preacher, no need for the sanction of God or the law. In his eyes, the transaction was already complete. He had not stolen just her mother's gold. He had stolen her purity, her name, her very future, without ever laying a hand on her. She was his, to be used as he saw fit. Whenever he decided she had been sufficiently broken, the realization was a quiet, internal shattering. The breaking point came on a sweltering Tuesday evening. A dust storm had blown in, rattling the windows and coating the air with a gritty film. Bo had been drinking, and the whiskey had sharpened the cruel edge in his voice. He had spent the evening taunting her, making veiled comments about her body, about what a husband was entitled to, his eyes burning with a possessive fire that made her skin crawl. He cornered her in the main room, blocking her path to her bedroom. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "My patience is wearing thin. Girl," he hissed, his face close to hers, the stench of whiskey on his breath. "The testing period is almost over. Soon, you will learn what it truly means to be my wife." He let her go abruptly, shoving her backward. She stumbled and caught herself on the wall. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and turned back to his drink. In that moment, Clara knew she could not wait for him to decide her fate. To stay was to die, not a quick death, but a slow, soul-crushing one. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Do not let them." Later that night, when the house was finally still and the only sound was the wind howling outside, Clara slipped out of her bed. She dressed in her sturdiest dress and boots, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure it could be heard throughout the house. She took nothing but her mother's Bible and journal, stuffing them into a small cloth sack. She did not know where she would go, only that she had to run. She crept through the darkened house, each creaking floorboard a scream in the silence. The back door was bolted. With trembling fingers, she slid the heavy lock free. The sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. She held her breath, listening, but there was no sound from the sheriff's room. Then she was outside, the wind tearing at her, the air thick with dust. She did not dare try for the stables. She simply ran, scrambling over a low section of the adobe wall and into the wild, untamed desert that stretched out into the blackness. She ran without thought, fueled by pure terror, the thorny branches of mesquite and creosote tearing at her skirt and scratching her skin. The wind erased her tracks as soon as she made them. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs were trembling with exhaustion. The storm began to subside, leaving a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars. The landscape was a disorienting sea of shadows and strange, twisted shapes. Every cactus was a man, every gust of wind a pursuing horse. She was hopelessly, terrifyingly lost. Dawn found her stumbling through a rocky arroyo, her lips cracked and her throat raw with thirst. The sun rose with a brutal, unforgiving intensity, beating down on her head. The world began to waver, the edges blurring. Her hope, which had burned so fiercely just hours before, began to flicker and die. She was going to perish out here, another nameless victim of the desert's cruelty. Her legs finally gave out. She collapsed in a heap at the bottom of a ravine, the rough gravel scraping her cheek. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the shadow of a vulture circling high in the merciless blue sky. Consciousness returned in brief, hazy fragments. A sound, the steady clop of a horse's hooves. A shadow falling over her. A sensation of being lifted, of strong arms holding her securely. She thought she was dreaming, that it was an angel come to carry her away. She managed to flutter her eyes open for a moment. The face looking down at her was no angel. It was a man's face, lean and hard, with a jagged scar that cut from his left eyebrow down to his jawline. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, and they held not malice, but a quiet, weary concern. His voice, when he spoke, was a low murmur, more a vibration she felt in her bones than a sound she heard with her ears. "Easy now," the stranger said. "I have you." He settled her in front of him on his horse, her head lolling against his chest. She was too weak to struggle, too exhausted to be afraid. She surrendered to the darkness again, carried away from the sun and the circling vultures by a wanted outlaw with a scarred face, hiding from the world in a remote canyon cabin. His name was Jesse Hart, and he had just found the one thing in the world more dangerous than the law, a reason to stop running. Clara surfaced from a deep, dark well of exhaustion, drawn upward by the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee. For a confused moment, she expected to feel the cold, polished floor of the sheriff's house against her cheek, to hear the wind rattling the barred windows. Instead, she felt the scratch of a wool blanket and the yielding support of a straw-stuffed mattress. She opened her eyes to a ceiling of rough-hewn wooden beams, darkened by years of smoke from a stone hearth that now glowed with a gentle, comforting warmth. She was in a small, one-room cabin. It was spare but clean, the epitome of a simple, solitary life. A worn table and 2 chairs stood near the fire. Shelves carved into the wall held a few tins, a skillet, and a small stack of books. A rifle leaned in the corner, its metal glinting in the firelight. Through the single, unadorned window, she could see the sheer, sun-baked rock of a canyon wall. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her, but her body was too heavy, too weary to respond. She tried to sit up, and a bolt of pain shot through her left ankle, making her cry out softly. The cabin door opened, and the man with the scarred face entered. He moved with a quietness that was startling for a man of his size. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly. He was tall and lean, dressed in durable, trail-worn clothes. The scar that ran down his face was old and white, a permanent mark of violence, but his eyes, a clear, steady gray, held no threat. He carried a bucket of water, which he set down with a soft thud. "You are awake," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones tumbling in a creek bed, yet it was surprisingly gentle. "Do not try to move. Your ankle is sprained. I wrapped it as best I could." He approached the cot, and Clara instinctively flinched, pulling the blanket tighter around her. He stopped a few feet away, his hands held loosely at his sides, a gesture that was neither aggressive nor placating. It was simply still. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, his gaze direct but not lingering. He looked at her face, not her body. It was such a small thing, but after weeks under Bo Reddick's appraising stare, it felt like a profound courtesy. "You were half dead from sun and thirst when I found you. You have been sleeping for nearly a day." He ladled some water into a tin cup and offered it to her. Her hands trembled as she took it, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was calloused and warm. He withdrew his hand immediately, as if he too were wary of the contact. She drank the water greedily. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. Who are you?" she managed, her voice a dry whisper. "Folks call me Jesse Hart," he said, taking the empty cup. This is my place. You are safe here." The name meant nothing to her, but the promise of safety was a balm on her raw nerves. Over the next few days, a quiet, careful rhythm established itself. Jesse was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a deep, almost forgotten kindness. He would leave food and fresh water by her cot while she slept. He redressed her ankle with a poultice of herbs that smelled of pine and earth. His touch firm and impersonal, his movements efficient. He never stayed in the cabin for long when she was awake, affording her a privacy that was both a relief and a source of quiet loneliness. He began to ask questions, but not in the prying, accusatory way Bo Reddick did. His inquiries were cautious, spoken as he sat across the room mending a piece of tack or cleaning his rifle, his eyes on his work. "What was a young woman like you doing all alone in that ravine?" he asked one afternoon. Clara's heart hammered. She could not tell him the truth, not all of it. The shame was a physical weight, a gag in her throat. She was afraid he would judge her, see her as spoiled goods, or worse, believe she was somehow to blame. I was running away," she said, her gaze fixed on the frayed edge of her blanket. "From who?" The question hung in the air. She took a ragged breath. "From the man I was supposed to marry. My father, he sold me to him." The words old came out before she could stop it, tasting vile and true on her tongue. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Jesse's hand still. He did not say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Some fathers are not worthy of the name. He did not press for more details, and she was grateful. She did not have to see the look in his eyes to know that her word had struck a nerve deep inside him. Jesse Hart had not always been an outlaw. He had once been a rancher, with calloused hands from mending fences. Not drawing a gun, he'd had a small piece of land in the Northern Territory, a herd of cattle, and a younger sister, Elora, with a laugh like wind chimes and hair the color of corn silk. They had been happy, carving a life from a hard but honest land. Then Silas Thorne, a land baron with a bottomless appetite for property and power, had decided he wanted their valley. He had tried to buy Jesse out, then threaten him. When Jesse refused to buckle, Thorne had turned his cruelty on Elora. He had caught her alone on her way back from town, his intentions as ugly as his soul. She had fought him, and he had left her bruised and broken in spirit. But he had not succeeded in his ultimate aim. Jesse had gone to the law, to the sheriff in the nearby town, a man who was squarely in Silas Thorne's pocket. The sheriff had laughed in his face, calling Elora a liar and a tease who had gotten what she deserved for leading on a man of Thorne's stature. The law, Jesse learned that day, was not a shield for the weak, but a club for the powerful. Justice was a commodity he could not afford. So he had sought his own. He found Thorne at a saloon that night, drunk and bragging. Jesse did not say a word. He had walked up to him, pulled his revolver, and shot him once through the heart. He had not run. He had waited for the sheriff, who had come to arrest him not for murder, but for disrupting the baron's profitable enterprise. Jesse had escaped from the flimsy jailhouse that night, a wanted man with a price on his head and a scar on his soul deeper than the one a deputy's bullet had carved into his face during the escape. He had been running ever since, a ghost in the canyons, his belief in the world of men shattered beyond repair. Clara knew nothing of this, but she saw the echoes of it in his quiet watchfulness, in the profound sadness that sometimes settled in his gray eyes when he thought she was not looking. She saw it in the way he treated her. He was a universe away from Bo Reddick. Jesse never stared at her body, never made a suggestive comment. When he handed her a plate of food or a cup of coffee, he was careful to ensure their hands did not touch. He spoke to her with a respect that no one had shown her in a long time, listening to her few, hesitant words as if they mattered. He was a man who understood what it was to have something precious violated, and he guarded her dignity as fiercely as he guarded his hideout. Slowly, painstakingly, a fragile trust began to grow in the space between them. She began to hobble around the cabin on her healing ankle, helping by sweeping the floor or washing their few dishes. The simple domestic tasks felt grounding, a way to reclaim a piece of herself. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the vast, starry silence of the canyon their only companion. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared solitude. One night, she spoke of her mother, of her love for books and the small garden she had tended behind their house in Promise. She always said that even in the desert, you could make something beautiful grow if you had enough faith and a little water. Jesse stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "My mother was like that," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "She saw the good in everyone, even when it was buried deep. She used to say a man's heart was like the soil. If you tended it right, it could grow anything." He fell silent, the weight of what his own heart had become settling between them. Clara's nights were plagued by nightmares. She would dream of Beau's cold eyes and his hard, possessive hands. She would hear his voice whispering that she was his property, that her testing was over. She would wake up with a strangled cry, her body drenched in a cold sweat, the terror so real it felt like he was in the cabin with them. One night, her cry was louder than usual. Jesse was at her side in an instant, a silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. He did not touch her, but stood a respectful distance from the cot. "It is just a dream," he said, his voice a low rumble of reassurance. "You are safe." "He is looking for me," she whispered, pulling her knees to her chest. "I know he is. He will find me and drag me back." Jesse was silent for a moment. "Then he will have to come through me first," he said with a quiet finality that was more comforting than any shouted promise. "He will not harm you here. I will not let him." He was right about one thing. Beau was looking for her. 2 days later, Jesse rode out at dawn to scout the area. He returned near dusk, his face grim, his jaw set in a hard line. He dismounted and unsaddled his horse without a word, his movements tense and angry. "What is it?" Clara asked, her stomach twisting into a knot. "A posse from Promise," he said, finally turning to face her. "They are combing the foothills. The sheriff is telling everyone you were taken, kidnapped by an unknown outlaw." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Of course, it was the perfect story. It painted him as the worried, righteous husband, and her as a helpless victim. It gave him license to hunt her down, and it ensured that no one would help her, that no one would believe her if she tried to tell the truth. She was trapped in his narrative. "We cannot stay here," Jesse said. "It is not safe for you anymore. As soon as you are strong enough to ride for a full day, I will take you to Willow Creek. It is a mining town, big enough to get lost in. You can find work, a new life. He will not think to look for you there." The thought of leaving the strange safety of the canyon filled her with a new kind of fear. Out there, she would be alone again. But she knew he was right. Staying here would endanger him as well. That night, the reality of her situation, of the lie Beau was spinning, crashed down on her. The kindness Jesse had shown her had given her the space to feel something other than terror. And now all the grief and rage and shame she had been holding back came pouring out. She sat by the fire, her mother's Bible in her lap, and began to cry, silent, racking sobs that shook her whole body. Jesse, who had been cleaning his revolver, set the gun down carefully. He did not approach her, but his quiet presence filled the room. "He told me," she began, her voice choked and broken. "He told everyone we were to be married, but it was a lie." The whole story came spilling out of her then, a torrent of poison and pain. She told him about her father's debts, about the dowry her mother had saved, the gold coins that were meant to be her shield. "He took it all. Jesse, he took the gold and he took me. He never had any intention of marrying me. There was no preacher, no papers. He said he was testing my obedience first. He said a man had to break a horse before he branded it. He kept me locked in that house, telling me I was his property, and he was just waiting until he decided I was broken enough. He was going to force himself on me. That is why I ran." She finished in a whisper, her head bowed, the hot tears of shame splashing onto the worn leather of the Bible. She had finally spoken the ugliest truth of all, and she braced herself for his disgust, for the judgment that was sure to come. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the crackle of the fire. She did not dare to look at him. After a long moment, she heard him rise and walk not towards her, but to the hearth. He stood with his back to her, one hand resting on the stone mantelpiece. She saw the muscles in his back and shoulders tense, his body rigid with a controlled fury. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped along the scarred side of his face. He said nothing. He offered no words of comfort, no empty platitudes. He simply stood there, absorbing the full weight of her confession, the ugliness of the world she had escaped. After a moment, he picked up a whetstone and his hunting knife. He sat down again, across the fire from her, and in the flickering light, he began to sharpen the blade. The sound filled the small cabin, a rhythmic, angry whisper of steel on stone. Shing, shing, shing. It was a cold, deliberate, and terrifyingly reassuring sound. It was the sound of a promise. After Clara's confession, the air in the small cabin changed. The terrible secret, once spoken aloud, lost some of its power over her. The shame had been lanced, and in the quiet understanding that passed between her and the outlaw, something new began to take root. In the days that followed, as her ankles strengthened, Clara moved about the cabin with a growing sense of purpose. She was no longer just a frightened creature hiding from a predator. She was a woman tending a home, however temporary it might be. The work was simple, but it was honest. She learned the rhythms of Jesse's life, rising with the first pale light to stir the fire to life. She would grind the coffee beans he kept in a small sack, the rich aroma filling the small space and chasing away the ghosts of her nightmares. She found a small bag of flour and, remembering her mother's touch, began to bake flat, dense bread on the skillet. The first few attempts were charred and heavy, but Jessie ate them without complaint. When she finally produced a loaf that was golden brown and soft on the inside, the quiet look of approval in his eyes felt more rewarding than any spoken praise. She took it upon herself to mend his clothes. His only spare shirt was ripped at the shoulder, the fabric frayed and thin. Using a small sewing kit from her mother's bag, she stitched the tear with small, even stitches. As she worked the needle through the coarse fabric, she felt a strange sense of intimacy, of caring for this quiet, scarred man who had shown her more decency than any lawman or even her own father. She was contributing, creating order and comfort in this small pocket of the world. With each task completed, she felt a piece of her own dignity, so brutally stripped from her by Bo Reddick, being stitched back into the fabric of her soul. Jesse watched her transformation from a careful distance. He saw the fear in her eyes recede, replaced by a quiet determination. He saw the way she held her shoulders a little straighter, the way her hands, once trembling and uncertain, moved with a newfound confidence. He had offered her shelter from the storm, but she was the one building a house within it. It stirred something in him he had long thought dead, a protective instinct that went beyond simple duty. She was becoming more than just a person he had to save. She was becoming a presence in the stark emptiness of his life. One afternoon, as Clara was kneading dough on the small wooden table, a sound drifted into the canyon, a faint, rhythmic drumming that was not the wind. Jesse, who had been oiling his rifle by the door, went still, his head lifted, his gaze fixed on the canyon mouth, his entire body a study in coiled tension.
"What is it?"
Clara whispered, her hands freezing in the flour-dusted dough. "Riders," he said, his voice a low growl. "Get your things, now." Panic, cold and familiar, flooded Clara's veins, but his calm urgency steadied her. She quickly stuffed her mother's Bible and journal into her sack as Jesse kicked dirt over the fire, snuffing out the last wisp of smoke. He grabbed his rifle and a canteen. "This way," he commanded, leading her out the back of the cabin and up a steep, rocky trail she had not noticed before. The sound of the horses grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. They were close. Jesse pushed her behind a large boulder and pointed to a dark slash in the rock face, almost completely hidden by a tangle of overgrown sagebrush. "In there. It is a tight fit, but it goes back a ways. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." She scrambled into the opening. It was a narrow fissure, cool and dark, smelling of damp earth and stone. Jesse followed her in, pulling the brush back into place to cover the entrance. The space was incredibly tight. They were pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, their bodies forced into an intimacy that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. She could feel the solid warmth of his body against hers, the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing, the smell of leather, dust, and him filled her senses. Outside, the posse rode into the clearing. Clara could hear the jingle of harnesses, the snort of horses, and the rough voices of men. "He ain't here," one man said. "The fire is cold. Looks like he cleared out days ago." "Search the cabin," a deeper voice commanded, a voice that made Clara's blood run cold. "Bo Reddick. He was here." Her breath hitched, and she felt Jesse's arm press firmly against her back, a silent command to remain calm. She could hear them ransacking the small cabin, the sound of things being overturned and thrown. It felt like a violation, an intrusion into the fragile peace they had built. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her face against the rough fabric of Jesse's shirt. In the cramped darkness, surrounded by danger, with the man she feared most only yards away, she felt a profound and paradoxical sense of safety. Here, pressed against this outlaw's side, she was protected. The terror that Bo's presence inspired was held at bay by the steady, living warmth of the man beside her. Hours passed. The sun began to set, casting long shadows that eventually plunged the cave into absolute blackness. The posse had made camp in the clearing, their voices a low murmur around their fire. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, washed over Clara. Her head grew heavy. The solid wall of Jesse's shoulder felt like the only stable thing in a world that had tilted off its axis. Without conscious thought, she leaned her head against him and drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Jesse stood rigid in the darkness, every muscle tensed. He felt the moment she surrendered to sleep, the soft weight of her head settling against his shoulder. Her breathing deepened, a soft, trusting whisper in the confined space. A war raged within him. He was a wanted man, a killer with nothing to offer a woman like her but a life on the run. He had no right to this closeness, no right to the innocent trust she gave him so freely, and yet the feel of her there, vulnerable and safe against him, awoke a fierce, primal need to protect her that eclipsed everything else, the bounty on his head, the ghosts of his past, the hopelessness of his future. He did not move a muscle, letting her rest, a stoic guardian in the dark. Before dawn, he woke her with a gentle touch. The posse was gone. He had slipped out in the night and created a false trail leading east, a trick he had learned long ago. It would buy them time. They traveled for the next few days, moving mostly at night. Jesse's knowledge of the rugged terrain their only map. The days blurred into a series of narrow escapes and shared hardships. They hid from patrols, drank sparingly from their canteen, and ate dried jerky that tasted of salt and survival. Through it all, Jesse's quiet competence was a constant reassurance. He was a man at home in this wilderness, and for the first time, Clara felt like she had a true protector. They finally reached the outskirts of Willow Creek as the sun was setting, painting the dusty hills in shades of orange and purple. It was a sprawling, chaotic mining town, clinging to the side of a mountain. The main street was a river of mud, lined with saloons, an assay office, and rough-hewn storefronts. The air was thick with the sounds of player pianos, shouted greetings, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. To Clara, it was a terrifying, overwhelming cacophony. Jessie led her not down the main street, but through a series of quiet back alleys until they reached a respectable-looking boarding house run by a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Gable. Before they went in, Jessie pressed a few coins into Clara's hand. "There is a mercantile down the street," he said, his voice low. "Buy yourself a new dress, something plain. It will attract less notice." He then gave her a small leather pouch. "This should be enough for a room for a few weeks, and for food. Tell the landlady your name is Sarah Brown. Tell her you came to town to find work." The finality in his tone sent a shard of ice through her heart.
And you?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper.
Where will you go?
"I will ride on," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "It is not safe for me here, and it is not safe for you to be seen with me." He was leaving her. The thought was a physical blow. After everything they had been through, he was going to disappear and leave her alone in this strange, intimidating place. Panic clawed at her throat. "No," she said, her hand darting out to grab his sleeve. It was the first time she had ever initiated contact with him.
Please do not leave me alone."
He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. Her eyes were wide with a desperate plea. He saw the raw terror there, and he knew he could not do it. He could not ride away and leave her to fend for herself. Not yet. A quiet sigh escaped his lips, a sound of weary resignation. "All right," he said softly. "I will not go far. I will find work at one of the ranches outside of town. I will use a different name, but you and I cannot be seen together. Clara, do you understand? It is the only way to keep you safe." The relief that washed over her was so immense it almost buckled her knees. She nodded, releasing his arm. A new life began. Clara, now Sarah Brown, bought a simple gray dress and rented a small, clean room at the back of Mrs. Gable's boarding house. She found work at a seamstress shop, her nimble fingers and experience mending her father's clothes serving her well. The days were long and monotonous, but the rhythmic work was soothing. For the first time in her life, she was earning her own money, building something that was hers. Every few days, Jessie would appear. He never came to the boarding house. She would see him across the street, leaning against a post, his hat pulled low, just watching. Or she would catch a glimpse of him riding past the shop. They were fleeting, silent encounters, but they were enough. They were a promise that she was not alone. He worked at a nearby ranch under the name Tom Miller, a quiet hand who kept to himself. He was always there, a guardian angel with a scarred face, watching from the shadows. For a few weeks, it seemed like their plan might work. Clara began to feel a fragile sense of hope. Then, one evening, the fragile world she was building came crashing down. She was walking home from the seamstress shop when she saw him, Sheriff Bo Reddick. He was standing in front of the saloon, a walking storm cloud of authority and menace, talking to the local marshal. He had not seen her. Clara ducked into an alleyway, her heart pounding, and fled back to the boarding house. She was in her room, her hands shaking so badly she could not unbutton her dress, when there was a sharp knock on the door. It was Mrs. Gable. Her face, usually just stern, was now a mask of cold fury. In her hand, she held a piece of paper. It was a wanted poster. On it was a crude but recognizable drawing of Jessie's face. "The sheriff from Arizona is in town," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with accusation. "He is looking for a kidnapped girl. He showed me this. I have seen that man, Tom Miller, watching this house, watching you. The sheriff says the girl is unstable, a runaway. I will not have that kind of trouble under my roof. You will pack your things and be gone by morning." The door shut with a definitive thud. Clara was alone, cast out. The lies Beau had woven were stronger than any truth she could tell. She sank onto the bed. Despair, a smothering blanket. He had found her. It was over. Later that night, there was a soft tapping on her window. It was Jesse. His face was a grim slash in the moonlight. "Pack your things," he whispered through the glass. "I am getting you out of here." He led her through the sleeping town, moving through the shadows like a phantom. They did not stop until they were miles out of town. At a small, isolated farmstead nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees, a Mexican widow named Elena, her face a roadmap of kindness and sorrow, opened the door. She greeted Jesse with a warm embrace and looked at Clara with compassionate eyes. "She can stay in the house," Elena said in Spanish-accented English. "No," Jesse replied. "It is better if no one sees her. We will stay in the barn." The barn was warm and smelled of hay and old leather. A single lantern cast dancing shadows on the high rafters. The tension between them was a palpable thing. Clara's carefully constructed new life had been demolished in a matter of hours. She felt raw, exposed, and utterly defeated. She turned to him, her body trembling, the words she had been holding back finally breaking free. "It is because of what he did to me, is it not? That is why they all believe him. Mrs. Gable, the whole town. They look at me, and they think I am damaged, tainted." Her voice broke. He did not force himself on me completely, Jesse, but he touched me, and in their eyes, that is enough. I am not pure anymore." She said the last words in a choked whisper, the ultimate shame laid bare. She expected him to turn away, to finally see her as the world did. Instead, Jesse closed the distance between them. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hands in his. His grip was firm, grounding. He looked directly into her eyes, and the weariness and sadness in his own seemed to bottomless. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. He lifted one of his calloused thumbs and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. "That is not something he could ever steal from you." He paused, searching for the right words. "Innocence. It is not a thing a man like that can touch. It is in here." He released one of her hands and gently tapped his finger over her heart. "It is a light, and no amount of his darkness can put it out." He held her gaze, his gray eyes clear and unwavering. "Do you hear me?" She could only nod, a fresh wave of tears blurring his scarred face. "Good," he whispered, his hand still holding hers. "Now get some rest. I told you he would have to come through me. I meant it. I am not leaving you." Beau Reddick was not a man accustomed to being defied. A girl running from his protection was an insult. A possession that had slipped its leash was an intolerable offense to his authority. When his own search proved fruitless, he did what powerful men do. He outsourced his fury. He hired 2 bounty hunters, brothers named Eli and Silas Kane, men who operated in the gray spaces between the law and the grave. Their reputation preceded them. They were known for their tenacity, their brutality, and their complete lack of conscience. Their instructions were simple: find the outlaw heart, recover the girl, and if the outlaw resisted, leave his body for the coyotes. The Kane brothers were cleverer than the sheriff's deputies. They did not just search for tracks, they searched for whispers. In the saloons and stables of Willow Creek, they heard the story of a quiet ranch hand named Tom Miller and a seamstress named Sarah Brown, who had both vanished on the same night. It did not take them long to connect the dots and follow the trail to the small, isolated farmstead of the widow Elena. They arrived under the cloak of darkness. They did not storm the house. Instead, they opted for a crueler, more patient tactic. They set a fire, a dry field bordering the property, a single tossed lantern, and the arid night air did the rest. Clara awoke to the acrid smell of smoke. She and Jesse had been sleeping in the hayloft, a fragile peace settling over them in the quiet dark. A moment later, Elena was hammering on the barn door, her voice shrill with panic. Jesse was on his feet in an instant, peering through a crack in the boards. An unnatural orange glow danced against the night sky, consuming the darkness, and the low, crackling roar of a wildfire was growing louder. "It is a trap," Jesse said, his voice a low, hard growl. He grabbed his rifle and his saddlebags. "They are trying to smoke us out, force us into the open." He helped Clara down the ladder. "Elena, get to the creek. Take the path behind the house. Stay low." The widow, her face streaked with tears, nodded and fled into the night. Jesse pulled Clara toward the back of the barn. "They will be watching the front, expecting us to run from the flames. We go the other way, toward the mountains." He slid the heavy back door open just enough for them to slip through. The heat was already intense, the air thick with burning grass and ash. They moved in a low crouch along a stone wall that separated the farm from the open range. Suddenly, a figure rose from behind a cluster of rocks, a silhouette against the fire, a rifle lifting to take aim. There was no time to think. Jesse shoved Clara to the ground, raised his own rifle, and fired. A single deafening crack echoed above the roar of the flames. The dark shape crumpled without a sound. Jesse did not spare the fallen man a second glance. He grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her to her feet. "Run!" They ran. They plunged into the darkness, away from the fire and the farm and the life that had been so briefly hers. Behind them, a second bounty hunter began to fire, the shots wild in the disorienting, smoke-filled night. The bullets whined past them, but Jesse did not slow, pulling Clara along, his grip like iron. They ran until their lungs were on fire and the sounds of pursuit faded behind them, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. As if summoned by the fire, the sky turned against them. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain, and the temperature plummeted. The first drops were fat and cold, striking the dry earth with audible hisses. Within minutes, the drizzle became a downpour. The sky tore open, and a lashing rain began to fall, turning the ground to slick mud and erasing their tracks more effectively than any decoy. Lightning bleached the landscape in stark, momentary flashes, followed by rumbling thunder that shook the very ground beneath their feet. The world dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos. Soaked, shivering, and exhausted, they stumbled on. Jesse finally spotted a dark overhang, a deep ledge carved into the side of a rocky bluff, offering a shallow promise of shelter. He guided Clara into the space. Out of the direct assault of the rain, it was not much, but it was something. They huddled together in the back of the shallow cave, the wind howling around them, the rain forming a silver, impenetrable curtain just feet away. Clara's teeth chattered uncontrollably, a deep, bone-rattling chill seizing her. Jesse stripped off his drenched outer shirt and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was a small, inadequate gesture against the cold, but the warmth of his body still clung to the fabric. She was trembling, but it was not just from the cold anymore. It was from the shock, the fear, the image of the man falling against the fire, and the stark, terrifying reality of their situation. She was a fugitive, running with a man who had just killed for her. She looked at him. His face, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was a mask of grim determination. His jaw tight, his gray eyes scanning the storm as if searching for their next attacker. In that moment, she saw the full weight of the burden he carried for her. He had sacrificed his solitude, risked his life, and taken another man's, all to keep her safe. A strange, fierce heat bloomed in her chest, a desperate, defiant energy. She was tired of being a victim, tired of being a burden, tired of being a thing that was bartered and hunted. She wanted to feel something that was not fear or shame. She wanted, just for a moment, to be the one who chose.
"Jesse,"
she said, her voice trembling but clear over the sound of the storm. He turned to her, his expression softening with concern. "What is it? Are you hurt?" She did not answer with words. She reached up, her cold fingers touching the rough, scarred skin of his jaw, and she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a soft or gentle kiss. It was a collision of desperation and discovery, a drowning woman's gasp for air. It was clumsy and raw, tasting of rain and fear and a sorrow too deep for words. But it was hers. This one thing, this single act, belonged to her and her alone. Bo Reddick could not touch it. His bounty hunters could not steal it. It was a reclamation. For a moment, Jesse was completely still, a statue of surprise. Then, a low groan rumbled in his chest, and his arms came around her, pulling her tight against him. He responded to her kiss, his mouth firm and searching against hers. It was a raw, emotional connection that went deeper than skin. It was a shared language of pain, of loneliness, of two broken souls finding a flicker of warmth in a cold, hostile world. The kiss deepened, becoming something more, a current of heat and need passing between them, a fire to ward off the storm inside and out. Then, just as suddenly, Jesse broke away. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. His hands, which had been holding her tightly, now rested gently on her shoulders, holding her at a small distance. "Clara," he whispered, his voice rough. "We cannot—"
I wanted to,
she said, her own voice breathless. "It was my choice." "I know," he said, and the tenderness in his voice made her want to weep. He lifted his head and looked at her, his gray eyes dark and serious in the dim light. "And I will not take a single thing from you that you are not sure you want to give. Not like this. Not when you are cold and scared and running for your life. When you are safe, when you are sure, then it will be your choice. But not now." He was giving her back the very thing she had been trying to claim, her own will. He was protecting her even from himself, from the raw emotions the storm had unleashed. She nodded, a profound and aching gratitude welling up inside her. They spent the rest of the night huddled together for warmth, the charged space between them now filled with a new, unspoken understanding. The next day, they reached a derelict mining shack clinging to the side of a mountain, high up in the hills. It was little more than a single room with a rusty stove and a leaky roof, but it was shelter, and it was far from the world of men. As Jesse worked to patch the roof and start a fire, the temporary nature of their safety settled over him. This was not a life. It was a holding pattern, a constant state of looking over his shoulder. That evening, as they sat before a small, sputtering fire, he confessed the thought that had been weighing on him. "I could turn myself in," he said, his voice quiet, his gaze fixed on the flames. "The bounty is for me. If I am gone, Reddick has no reason to hunt you. You could go somewhere new, start over, be free." Clara stared at him, horrified. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "Absolutely not. He would still find me, and you would be in a cage, or worse. The world has already taken too much from both of us. I will not let you sacrifice yourself." Her refusal was absolute, leaving no room for argument. She would rather be a fugitive with him than free without him. His quiet surrender to her will marked another shift between them. They were no longer just a protector and his charge. They were partners, bound together in a shared struggle. The days that followed in the small shack were quiet, almost peaceful. They fell into a domestic rhythm, a strange imitation of a life they could never truly have. They washed their clothes in a frigid mountain stream, the icy water a sharp reminder of their isolation. They shared simple meals of beans and dried meat, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. In the afternoons, they would sit on the rickety porch and watch thunderstorms roll in over the distant peaks, the dramatic display of nature a reflection of the turmoil they had left behind. Jesse, seeing the steely resolve in her, decided that if she was to be a partner, she needed to be able to protect herself. He taught her how to handle his revolver. At first, The weapon felt heavy and alien in her hands, a tool of violence she wanted nothing to do with. But Jesse was a patient teacher. He showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. "Do not think of the noise," he told her. "Think only of the target. A steady hand comes from a steady mind." When she finally hit the tin can he had set on a stump, a thrill of fierce, competent pride shot through her. He also taught her to ride not as a passenger, but as a rider, to feel the rhythm of the horse, to become one with its movements. With each new skill she mastered, Clara felt another layer of fear and helplessness slough away, replaced by a core of quiet confidence. One evening, as she was repacking her small sack, a folded, yellowed piece of paper fell from the pages of her mother's Bible. Jessie picked it up. It was a letter, written in her mother's elegant, fading script. "It was the last one she wrote me," Clara said softly, "before she got too sick." With her permission, he carefully unfolded it and read it aloud by the flickering firelight. His low voice gave weight to the words, breathing life back into the ink. It was a letter of love, of hope, but it was also a letter of profound strength. "My dearest Clara," it read, "the world can be a harsh and unforgiving place. It will test you, and it will try to break your spirit. Survival is a bitter root, and there will be times when it is all you can do to hold on. But I pray you find the courage not just to survive, but to choose. Choose kindness in the face of cruelty. Choose forgiveness, not for the sake of those who have wronged you, but for your own. And above all, my darling daughter, choose love, even if it is born in darkness, for it is the only light that can truly guide you home." When he finished, a profound silence filled the shack. The letter was not just a memory of her mother. It was a map. It was a guide through the very darkness she now found herself in. Her mother had understood that survival was not enough. A life lived in fear was no life at all. True freedom lay in the power to choose. A single sob broke from Clara's throat. Then another. It was a storm of grief she had held back for months. She wept for her mother, for the life she had lost, for the innocence that had been threatened. But she also wept with a sudden, piercing clarity. She had been so focused on surviving Bo Reddick, on simply staying alive, that she had forgotten to live. Her mother wanted more for her. She wanted her to choose happiness. Jesse said nothing. He simply sat with her, a silent, steady presence, until the storm of her tears subsided. Later that night, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, she went to him where he lay in his bedroll. She knelt beside him, her face illuminated by the soft glow.
"I am choosing Jesse,"
she whispered, her voice clear and strong.
"I am not scared, and I am sure."
He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers, and he saw the truth of her words. He saw the strength, the clarity, the choice. He reached up and gently touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her cheek. This time, he did not pull away. They came together not with the desperate, frantic energy of the storm, but with a quiet, deliberate tenderness. It was an act of profound trust, a silent promise made in the heart of the wilderness. For Clara, it was the ultimate reclamation of herself, a gentle mending of what had been torn. For Jesse, it was a step out of the shadows, a rediscovery of a part of his soul he had thought long dead. In the quiet solitude of the mountain shack, surrounded by a world that wanted them broken or dead, they chose each other, finding in their shared darkness a light strong enough to guide them. The fragile peace of the mountain shack was shattered not by a posse's bullet, but by a whisper on the wind. An old, grizzled prospector, leading a pack mule, stumbled upon their camp one morning. He was a harmless wanderer Jesse had shared coffee with once or twice in years past. He squinted at Jesse, then at Clara, and a look of dawning recognition and fear crossed his face.
"Hart?"
the old man rasped, his eyes wide.
"I thought you were a ghost. You best keep being one. The whole territory is buzzing. Sheriff from down Arizona way, a man named Reddick, is in Willow Creek.
He is spinning a wild tale." The prospector took a swig from his canteen, his eyes darting nervously toward the trail he had just climbed. "He says his young wife, a poor, simple-minded thing, was snatched right from his home by you. He is painting you as the devil himself, and her as a lunatic who needs to be brought back under his care. He has got a circuit judge and a preacher on their way. They say he means to have them sign marriage papers, legal and proper, and declare you a kidnapper in the eyes of God and the law." The old man wished them luck and hurried on his way, eager to put distance between himself and the trouble he had found. His words hung in the cold mountain air, heavy and poisonous. Bo was not just hunting them anymore. He was rewriting their history, trying to legally chain Clara to him forever and brand Jesse a criminal beyond redemption. Jesse began to pack their few belongings, his movements swift and grim. "We have to go deeper into the mountains, north toward the territories. We can disappear." Clara stood motionless, her mother's letter clutched in her hand. She heard the words, "Choose kindness, choose forgiveness, choose love." But another word now rang louder than the rest. Choose. Survival was a bitter root, her mother had written, and Clara was tired of chewing on it. Running felt like another form of survival, another way of letting Bo Reddick dictate the terms of her life. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. Jesse stopped, turning to face her. "Clara, you heard the man, a judge, a preacher. He is making it law. Once those papers are signed, you will legally be his wife. Every lawman in the West will be hunting for his kidnapped bride." "And if we run, what does that look like to them?" she countered, stepping toward him, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "It looks like he is telling the truth. It looks like a savage outlaw dragging a helpless, unstable girl into the wilderness. Running proves his lie for him. We have been hiding in the darkness. Jesse, his darkness. The only way to beat it is to step into the light." The thought terrified him. The light meant towns and laws and jails. For her, it could mean being handed back to the very monster she had fled. "He will destroy you. Clara, he will twist your words, use your past against you. They will not listen to a runaway girl over a sheriff." "Maybe," she conceded, her voice softening as she reached out and touched his arm. "Maybe they will not. But my mother told me to choose, and I am choosing to fight. I will not let him write my story. I will not let him turn you into a monster to save his own wicked pride. I am going back to Willow Creek." She looked at him, her heart in her eyes. "I would rather face them with you than run for the rest of my life alone." He looked at the woman before him. She was not the same terrified girl he had found collapsed in a ravine. The fear was still there, a shadow behind her eyes, but it was dwarfed by a formidable strength. She was right. Running would only validate the lie. Reluctantly, with a heavy sense of foreboding that settled deep in his bones, he nodded. He would stand with her, even if it meant walking directly into the hangman's noose. They rode into Willow Creek on a Sunday morning. The sound of a lone church bell echoed over the rooftops, calling the pious to prayer. But a larger crowd was gathering in front of the town hall, a rough-hewn two-story building that also served as the courthouse. A sense of occasion hung in the air, a mixture of curiosity and grim entertainment. Bo Reddick stood on the steps, dressed in a black suit, looking every bit the grieving, authoritative husband. Beside him stood a portly, nervous-looking preacher and a stern, gray-bearded man Clara assumed was the circuit judge. Clara and Jesse dismounted at the edge of the crowd. They were dusty, trail-worn, and out of place amongst the townspeople in their Sunday finery. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. They recognized the outlaw from the poster, and the girl who was said to be his victim. Bo Reddick's eyes found them. For a fraction of a second, a look of pure, murderous rage flashed across his face, but he quickly masked it with a somber expression of relief. "Clara!" he called out, his voice booming with false emotion.
Thank God! You are safe!
He started down the steps, his arms outstretched as if to welcome a beloved wife home. This was his stage, his performance, and he was the hero of the story. But Clara did not play her part. She held her ground, her chin high, and her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper of a victim, but the clear, ringing tone of an accuser.
I was never in danger from him,
she declared, gesturing toward Jesse. The only man I ever needed saving from is you, Sheriff Reddick. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Bo froze on the steps, his mask of concern cracking. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing.
I am not your wife,
Clara continued, her voice gaining strength with every word, fueled by the truth she had held inside for so long. I was never legally wed to you. There was no ceremony, no vows. You made a deal with my father. You took my dowry, a pouch of gold coins my mother left me, and you took me as payment for his debts. You held me in your house as a prisoner, telling me I was your property, waiting to do with me as you pleased. That is not a marriage. That is a crime. The crowd erupted in a tumult of murmurs and exclamations. Bo Reddick's face turned a mottled shade of purple. She is unwell, he shouted, trying to regain control.
The ordeal has confused her. Judge, this is the proof of what I have been saying. The girl is delusional.
I am not delusional, Clara said, her voice cutting through the noise. I am free. At that moment, Jesse began to walk forward. He moved slowly, deliberately, through the parting crowd. He stopped before the town marshal, a lanky man named Peters whose face was a mixture of shock and confusion. Jesse raised his hands to shoulder height. My name is Jesse Hart, he said, his voice calm and steady, carrying to every corner of the square. There is a warrant for my arrest, and I am turning myself in. But I am not a kidnapper. I demand a trial, a fair trial for the crimes I have committed, and I demand that this town give this woman a chance to tell her truth, and that you investigate Sheriff Bo Reddick for theft and coercion. The marshal, looking utterly bewildered, unholstered his pistol but seemed unsure what to do next. The town was now deeply and visibly divided. Some of the older, more severe-looking women stared at Clara with open contempt, whispering the words, fallen and damaged goods. They saw a girl who had run off with an outlaw, a story as old as sin itself. To them, her purity was compromised, and with it, her word. But others looked at her with a dawning sympathy. They were the ones who had chafed under Bo's heavy-handed rule, the ones who had seen his cruelty and suspected his corruption. A young woman with intelligent eyes and a determined chin stepped forward from the crowd. It was Miss Albright, the town's new schoolteacher.
Judge,
she said, her voice clear and educated.
This woman has made a serious accusation against a man of the law. Whatever the circumstances, she deserves to be heard. To dismiss her as unwell without a proper inquiry would be a gross miscarriage of justice.
The judge, a man named Harrison, looked from Miss Albright's earnest face to Bo's furious one, then to Clara's resolute stance. He was a man who valued order and the letter of the law above all else. This public spectacle was a mockery of both. This proceeding is concluded for today, he announced, his voice a gavel's rap. The matter of the marriage contract is suspended. Marshal Peters, take Mr. Hart into custody. He will be held pending a formal hearing on all these matters. Young lady, he said, his stern gaze falling on Clara, you will need to be prepared to substantiate these claims. Jesse allowed the marshal to take his revolver and lead him toward the town jail. As he passed Clara, his eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not fear, but a quiet, profound pride. The judge's decision left Clara in a precarious limbo. Mrs. Gable, the boarding house owner, wanted nothing to do with her, but under the watchful eye of Miss Albright, she reluctantly agreed to let Clara have her old room back, on the condition that she paid in advance. Clara knew she had little time. That afternoon, She sought out the preacher, a man named Reverend Michael. She found him in the small church, a man clearly distressed by the morning's events. She did not approach him with hysterics or tears. She sat in the front pew and spoke calmly, laying out the entire story. From her father's gambling debts to Beau's psychological torment, she showed him her mother's Bible and the final, poignant letter tucked within its pages. She described the gold coins, the way they felt in the leather pouch, the shield they were meant to be. The preacher listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to deep concern. "My child," he said when she had finished, his voice heavy with compassion, "you have endured a great trial. The law must decide the truth of this, but the Word of God teaches us to protect the vulnerable. I will pray on this matter." She had planted a seed of doubt. It was a start. But Beau Reddick was not a man to be defeated by prayer. That night, the storm he had been holding back finally broke. Clara was in her small room, a single lamp burning, when she heard a heavy footstep in the hall. It was too heavy to be Mrs. Gable. A key scraped in the lock. The door swung open and a large, brutish man filled the doorway. It was Hank, Beau's deputy, his face flushed with whiskey and malice. "Sheriff says you have been telling lies," he sneered, stepping into the room and shutting the door behind him. "He says you need to be reminded of your place. He wants you to write a confession. Say the outlaw filled your head with nonsense." He took another step, and the small room seemed to shrink. The look in his eyes was not just threatening, it was predatory. This was not about a confession. This was about punishment, about terror. The same cold dread that had sent her fleeing into the desert seized her, but this time, something else rose with it. A white-hot, cleansing rage. She would not be a victim again. As he lunged for her, she sidestepped and grabbed the heavy ceramic water pitcher from the washstand. She swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of his head. The pitcher shattered, and the deputy staggered back with a roar of pain and surprise, a dark gash opening on his temple. That was all the time she needed. She wrenched the door open and fled down the hall and out into the night, his curses echoing behind her. She did not run to the marshal's office. She ran, breathless and shaking, to the one place she knew she was understood, the one place her truth was already known. She ran to the jail. A lone deputy sat dozing at a desk. She shook him awake, gasping out what had happened. Alarmed, he followed her as she rushed to the back, to the small, barred window of Jesse's cell. Jesse was on his feet the moment he heard her voice. He gripped the bars, his face a mask of fury and desperation as he took in her disheveled appearance, the wild fear in her eyes. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Clara, who did this?" "It was his deputy," she choked out, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving her trembling. "He came to my room. He tried to—" She could not finish the sentence. A terrible, guttural sound of pure rage came from Jesse's throat. He rattled the bars of his cell, the iron groaning under the force of his fury. He was a caged tiger, helpless to protect the one person he cared about. "I will kill him," he swore, his voice raw. "When I get out of here, I will kill them both." "No," she said, her own fear transmuting into a fierce, protective strength for him. She reached through the bars, her fingers finding his. "We will beat them with the truth. We will not become them." He looked at her, his anger warring with the agony of his helplessness. He saw the cut on her cheek where a piece of the shattered pitcher had grazed her. He saw the terror she was fighting to control. And he saw the unbreakable spirit her mother had written about. "I will protect you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Even from in here, I will find a way." Clara leaned forward, pressing her face against the cold iron bars. She closed her eyes, her hand tightening on his. Then she kissed him through the bars, a desperate, defiant act of love and solidarity in the face of the darkness that was trying to consume them. It was a promise. They were in this together, and they would not be broken. The Willow Creek Town Hall was not built for courtroom dramas, but on the day of the hearing, it strained to become one. The room was packed to the rafters, smelling of dust, sweat, and nervous anticipation. Every bench was full, and men stood 3 deep along the back wall, their faces a mixture of grim curiosity and judgment. Judge Harrison sat at a makeshift bench at the front, his face impassive, a bulwark of solemn law against the tide of public opinion. Jesse sat beside the town marshal, his wrists in cuffs, his expression unreadable. Clara sat in the front row, flanked by the protective presence of Miss Albright, the school teacher. Her hands were folded in her lap, still and calm, a stark contrast to the frantic beating of her heart. Sheriff Bo Reddick was called to testify first. He strode to the front of the room with the unshakable arrogance of a man who believed the world was built to serve his own appetites. He did not look at Clara. He addressed the judge, but his words were meant for the town, a performance of aggrieved authority. "Judge Harrison," he began, his voice a low, confident rumble. "I stand before you a wronged man. I took a wife, Clara Dawson, in good faith, from a father who could no longer provide for her. I gave her a home, protection, everything a woman could ask for." He paused, letting the weight of his supposed generosity settle over the room. But the girl, I soon realized, was not well. Her mind, it is a fragile thing, prone to fantasies, to hysterics. She was a difficult creature, but I was patient. I treated her with a firm but gentle hand, as one must with a child or a fine but skittish horse. A few men in the crowd nodded, their faces reflecting the simple, ugly logic of his words. A woman's mind was a mystery, and a powerful man knew how to manage it. "Then this man," Bo said, turning and pointing a damning finger at Jesse. "This savage, this outlaw Hart, saw an opportunity. He preyed on her weakness. He filled her head with poison, with wicked lies, and he stole her away from my home. He is a kidnapper and a brute, and she is his victim, too confused and frightened to even know it. All I ask is for the return of my legal wife, so that I might care for her, and for this animal to be punished to the fullest extent of the law." He finished and returned to his seat, a picture of righteous indignation. The air in the room was thick with his lies, convincing in their simplicity. Judge Harrison looked at Clara. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice neutral, "you may approach." Clara stood, her legs feeling unsteady for a moment. She took a deep breath, clutching the small, worn Bible in her hands as if it were a shield. She walked to the front of the room, not looking at the dozens of pairs of eyes on her, but at the judge. She would speak her truth to the law. "My name is Clara Dawson," she began, her voice clearer and stronger than she had expected. "And I am not, nor have I ever been, the wife of Bo Reddick." She turned her head and, for the first time, met the sheriff's furious gaze without flinching. "I was his prisoner." She then told them everything. She spoke of her father, his weakness, his debts. She spoke of her mother's dowry, the pouch of gold coins meant to ensure a respectable life, and how it had been used to purchase her like property. "Sheriff Reddick never spoke of love or marriage vows," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "He spoke of a transaction. He told my father he would take me, and his debts would be cleared." She described the cold, silent ranch house, the constant surveillance, the way he had stripped her of all freedom. "He told me I was his property now. He said he was testing my obedience, and that a man needed to break a horse before he put his brand on it." Those were his words. Does that sound like a husband, judge, or does it sound like a master? A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Men shifted uncomfortably on the benches. Women looked at each other, a flicker of understanding, of shared fear, passing between them. Clara's voice grew stronger, fueled by the memory of the terror. "He tried to break my spirit. He controlled when I ate, what I wore, who I spoke to, which was no one. He wanted to own not just my body, but my mind. I ran from that house not because I was lured away, but because I was afraid for my life and for my soul. I ran into the desert with nothing but the clothes on my back and my mother's Bible. I chose the chance of death in the wilderness over the certainty of a living death with him. She then turned to the subject of Jesse. Jesse Hart found me near death. He took me in. He gave me shelter and food. He tended my injuries. He never once laid a hand on me in anger or in lust. He treated me with a respect that Sheriff Reddick is incapable of understanding. He did not kidnap me. He saved me. She finished, her chest heaving. The truth finally laid bare for all to see. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by a single, sharp cough from the back of the room. Judge Harrison stared at her, his expression thoughtful. A deep line creased between his brows. "These are grave accusations, Miss Dawson," he said slowly. "Do you have any proof of this transaction, of this dowry you speak of?" Before Clara could answer, a woman stood up in the middle of the crowd. She was a sturdy ranch wife with work-roughened hands and a plain, honest face. "My name is Martha Peterson," she said, her voice nervous but firm. "My husband and I, we sell chickens and eggs. I made a delivery to the sheriff's ranch a few weeks back. The girl here, she came to the door. She was pale as a ghost, and she had a bruise on her arm, shaped like a man's fingers." Bo Reddick shot to his feet. "That is a lie. The girl is clumsy. She probably bumped into a door." "Order," the judge commanded, banging a small mallet on the table. "Mrs. Peterson, you may continue." "That is all I saw," the woman said, sitting back down. "But it was not a bruise from a door, and the look in her eyes, it was the look of a trapped animal." Another witness then came forward, guided by Miss Albright. It was the widow, Elena. She stood before the judge, her dark eyes sad but resolute. She spoke in her soft, accented English, and told of the night Jesse had brought a terrified Clara to her farm. "She was not a crazy woman," Elena said, looking directly at the judge. "She was a frightened child. She was running from a monster. This man," she said, gesturing to Jesse. "He protected her. He treated her like a daughter or a sister. He is a good man, whatever the law says." The foundation of Bo Reddick's story was crumbling. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, more sympathetic to Clara. Finally, Judge Harrison turned his attention to the man in cuffs. "Mr. Hart," he said, "you have heard the accusations against you. How do you plead to the charge of kidnapping?" "Not guilty," Jesse said, his voice low and clear. He stood up, the chains on his wrists clinking softly. "I never held her against her will." "And what of the other charges against you?" the judge pressed. "The warrant from the Northern Territory, the matter of the death of Silas Thorne?" A hush fell over the room. This was the moment of truth. Jesse did not flinch. He looked at the judge, and then his eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, finally resting on Clara. "I will not deny what I did," he said. "I killed Silas Thorne, but I am no murderer." He then told them the story he had only ever told Clara. He spoke of his sister, Elora, of her bright spirit and her laughter. He told them of the land baron, a man so powerful he believed he could take whatever he wanted, land, cattle, even people. He described the assault, the brutal way Thorne had tried to break his sister's spirit, and the callous dismissal he had received from a sheriff bought and paid for by Thorne's money. "The law would not help her," Jesse said, his voice raw with the memory of that long-ago injustice. "There was no justice to be found for a rancher's daughter against a wealthy man. So I sought my own. I did what the law should have done. I did what any brother, any decent man, would do. I ran because I knew I would never get a fair trial in a county owned by Silas Thorne's friends. I have been running ever since." He looked back at Judge Harrison. "I have broken the law, but I have never, not once, harmed an innocent person. When I found Clara, I saw in her the same thing I saw in my sister, a good soul being crushed by a cruel, powerful man who believed the law was his personal weapon. I did for her what I wished someone had been there to do for my sister. I helped her get away. If that makes me a criminal, then I will accept the judgment." He sat down. The room was utterly still. Jesse's story had done more than explain his past. It had drawn a stark, damning parallel. He and Clara were two sides of the same coin, both victims of a corrupt system where power, not justice, was the ultimate authority. Judge Harrison was silent for a long time, his fingers steepled before him. He looked at Bo Reddick's face, which was now a mask of pure, uncontrolled fury. He looked at Clara, at her quiet strength. He looked at Jesse, at the weary dignity of a man who had finally stopped running. "This court," the judge finally announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "is not a party to backroom deals and coerced arrangements. Based on the testimonies I have heard today, the petition to formalize a marriage between Sheriff Reddick and Miss Dawson is denied. There is no marriage." A collective sigh of relief went through half the room. Furthermore, the judge continued, his gaze hardening as he looked at Bo. "The accusations of theft and abuse of authority leveled against Sheriff Reddick are deeply troubling. I am hereby ordering the federal marshal to open a formal investigation into the affairs of the Promise, Arizona Sheriff's Department, starting with the matter of this stolen dowry." Bo Reddick looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His power, his entire world, was beginning to crumble around him. "As for you, Mr. Hart," the judge said, turning back to Jesse, "the circumstances of your past actions are compelling. While this court cannot simply dismiss the federal warrant, it is clear that the case requires significant reevaluation. I am setting your bond at a reasonable sum. Pending a full review by the federal authorities, you will be released on your own recognizance." The next few hours were a blur for Clara, armed with a legal order signed by Judge Harrison and accompanied by the steely-eyed Marshal Peters. She walked into the Willow Creek Bank where Bo kept a private lockbox. Bo was forced to open it. Inside, amongst his papers, was a heavy leather pouch. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. The gold coins, her mother's legacy, spilled into her palm. A tangible piece of her past and her future returned to her. She did not keep it all. The next morning she walked to the small, struggling town orphanage, a place she had noticed on her first day working at the seamstress shop. She handed the woman in charge a substantial portion of the gold. "My mother would have wanted this to help build a better future," she said simply. The act was a release, a final break from the greed that had almost destroyed her. The dowry was not a price to be paid for a husband. It was a shield to be used for good. That afternoon, Jesse's bond was posted by a small group of townspeople, organized by Miss Albright and Mrs. Peterson. He stepped out of the jailhouse and into the bright afternoon sun, a free man, at least for now. Clara was waiting for him. She did not run to him, did not throw her arms around him. She just stood there, a small, steady smile on her face, and waited. He walked over to her, the weariness of the past weeks evident in the lines around his eyes. But for the first time, there was no shadow of the hunted man in his gaze. He simply took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. No words were needed. They did not stay in Willow Creek. Their victory was a temporary one, and the world was still a dangerous place. Jesse's case was still pending, and Bo Reddick, though disgraced, was still a venomous snake. They bought 2 sturdy horses and supplies with the last of the dowry money. Together, they rode out of town, heading north toward the open spaces, the vast, untamed frontier. They were no longer fugitives, pursued by the law. They were pioneers, seeking a new life. The story ends not in a town, but on a trail. Clara, stronger and wiser, rides tall in the saddle beside Jesse. The sun is warm on her face, and the future is a vast,
unknown territory stretching out before them. His hand reaches over and finds hers, their fingers intertwining on the pommel of her saddle. She looks at him, her heart full, not of a girlish infatuation, but of a deep, quiet love forged in fear and fire. She was not a damsel who had been saved by a handsome hero. She was a woman who had walked through the darkest valley and found the courage to save herself, and in doing so, had found a fellow traveler to walk beside her into the light. She had not been saved. She had been reborn. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow Western enthusiasts. And please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel to share your thoughts in English on this and other tales.